Hi, this is Jim Leffler. I'm just going to do a quick review of the paper that I had sent out in case folks don't have a chance to read it. Probably takes about an hour to read, and hopefully I can complete this in like 5 to 10 minutes. So what I was hoping to kind of think about was challenging the hegemony of the symptom. And I used Warren Kinghorn's paper from 2020 to do so. I'll just review the claims of that paper, the problems with the symptom-based approach, and then an alternative. So the claims of what Dr. Kinghorn was talking about is that the DSM and the philosophy behind the DSM understands mental disorders as the symptoms, so there just are symptoms. By focusing primarily on the symptoms as the organizing principle, it was meant to be an atheoretical frame. But as I'll get into, it kind of creates an own self-fulfilling understanding of what a disorder is. And it all becomes kind of rarefied in the idea of a symptom. And then the goal of the psychiatrist or psychologist is you evaluate the degree of distress by calculating the number of symptoms and the amount of disability by thinking about the functional decline. In terms of post-traumatic stress disorder, Dr. Kinghorn utilizes PTSD within the DSM and then moral injury as an alternative formulation in a way to try to point out some of the faults of the current DSM structure. One large issue with the current structure of DSM-5 understanding of PTSD is that it does not recognize agent-related trauma, meaning a trauma that is caused by the person towards others. Another place I would point out is it does seem that complex PTSD seems to inhabit a similar place where it can kind of demonstrate how PTSD does not take into account the chronic stress of many people's lived experiences and with attachment issue traumas or other forms of kind of chronic stress. A moral injury framework, which was developed by Shea in the 1990s, Jonathan Shea as a psychiatrist, has also been folded into the symptom-based methodology. Thus, attempts to fix the issue will encounter the same systemic problem, that when someone tries to introduce a new entity to anticipate or mediate the fact that, say, PTSD did not address agent-related trauma so much, the new entity, in this case moral injury, will be incorporated into the symptoms again, if it follows the second pathway here, where it becomes domesticated by the research entity, as opposed to causing people to recognize their mistake and think about how to reformulate perhaps our understanding of mental disease. So what is the problem with the symptom-based approach? Dr. Kinghorn says many well-articulated things, but I'll just comment on a few here. So first of all, it's a self-reinforcing system. If symptoms is the organizing principle, the disorder is a symptom, and then you measure the symptoms, and the way you know you're doing a good job is if you reduce the symptoms. So it's kind of like a system that operates within itself, and there's no kind of point of entry for other alternative ideas of how we decide that someone has a better outcome. Interestingly, I hear this conversation a lot at the in my clinical work, when people's symptoms don't get better, then people will incorporate kind of a new understanding of what's happening. So 4 structural limitations to a symptom approach. The locus of pathology ends up on the individual. This is very much counter to what Shatan and the other folks who helped develop the idea of the post-Vietnam syndrome, which was the political syndrome, so to speak, that was developed by Vietnam veterans after returning from the war. The post-Vietnam syndrome, however, was highly related to the American intervention in Vietnam. So by changing it from understanding the experience of soldiers in a particular war in a particular context, we move from discussing kind of the United States have been involved in this war, what was at play, should the American citizens understand it, to blaming the soldiers themselves who have the symptoms. Not blaming, but saying that that's where the pathology lies, not in some larger context. Also, the context becomes superfluous. So Dr. Kinghorn goes to good lengths to demonstrate that the initial formulation of the PTSD diagnosis in DSM-3 was actually by a researcher who had been studying the stress response to people with severe burns. And so PTSD was folded into the same reaction as one would have from a severe physical burn, thus eliminating kind of any intrapsychic understandings and the context in which it happened. Also, by focusing on symptoms, we encourage technical solutions that don't really have any kind of moral sense or help people think about, is this a good solution or a bad solution? One example of that I would give that's outside of what we've read is the idea of burnout and how burnout does kind of become a clinical syndrome that can now be monitored, focuses on the individual, and then solutions become kind of individualized ideas like meditating more. Interestingly, meditation itself has been shown in certain people to actually increase selfishness. Whereas Judith Herman, one of the great pioneers of trauma research, asks the question, should we not be moving towards a life worth living and kind of creating meaning? Additionally, Kinghorn points out that by focusing on symptoms, it becomes unnecessarily stigmatizing, as demonstrated by the fact that people aren't sure if they should call it post-traumatic stress disorder or just post-traumatic stress or some other names. Kinghorn then offers an alternative frame. By engaging in listening, we can then move to incorporate narrative and context. We can see trauma as a fragmented sense of agency, so unable to determine what I should or shouldn't do in a situation, a disrupted narrative that feels broken, and that it results in torn relationships with self and community. And thus healing would transition to a reconnection to the self, a re-understanding and reformulation of one's narrative, and a rejoining of the community despite the traumatic event. So I hope that's helpful. I would encourage you to read what Dr. Kinghorn himself had to say on the issue, but thought I would offer this in case you didn't have a chance to read the whole document.